Session today then really is a public talk we're giving as part of International Women's Week, well, International Women's Month. But one of the things we're interested in talking about is women as sports leaders, because there are some issues currently with women in leadership positions in sport. We know there's issues with women in sport generally, but in leadership positions and leadership and coaching, there are some significant issues and problems. If any of you are working or looking at working on women in sports leadership, then the Beyond 30 womeninsport.org findings for 2016 are really useful in terms of getting the current up-to-date information. So that particular site there is a particularly good site for anybody who wants to access information on leadership. They found in that study that there's been no change in the percentage of women in all leadership roles in sport, and it's stayed basically at about 30% for the last 3 years. And there's actually been a fall in the percentage of women in senior leadership positions to 36% from a high of 42% in 2014. So in fact, senior leaders, female leaders in sport, appear to be going down rather than going up. And in performance director roles, which is the role that controls high performance sport within national governing bodies, it's currently running at 24%. On Sport England and UK sport funding national governing bodies, under half of those governing bodies do not meet the new requirements for national governing bodies who get public funds. So if a national governing body is dependent on public funding for its operation, they're expected to have a minimum of 30% of women on their controlling boards. 9 of 68 national governing bodies have no women at all in senior leadership roles. That's excluding the Chief Executive Officer of those organisations. In coaching, a study done in 2011 by Sports Coach UK identified that although 49% of the population is male, 69% of the coaching population is male. So there's a clear imbalance there between the normal gender breakdown in terms of the population and the gender breakdown in terms of coaching. And the higher up you go coaching, so the higher levels of coaching you go, the fewer and fewer women appear in those roles. So we've clearly got an issue with gender balance in terms of the control of British sport. And it's nothing new, and it's been there for some time, and some of the biographies that we're going to look at now identify women who were working in positions, so there's always been women working in positions of governance in sport, but somehow we don't seem to have moved on from that. Maybe we'll reflect on that right at the end of the session today. And it reflects really the historic coding of sports as male. They're a male activity. This is what males do, not what females do. And also that the dominant leadership traits in sport are masculine: power, control, high energy, looking for achievement. All of those things are associated with male traits rather than with female traits, which are seen as much more sharing, caring, looking after people, and are really related to the idea of it being some kind of domesticity as being a role of women. But since 1900, and in the period that we're going to be talking about today, which is in the interwar period between 1918 and 1939 basically, some women have transgressed those norms. So it's not that there's not been women there, it's just that those women have not been able to generate some kind of legacy that's developed since 1939. And this talk really illustrates some of their contribution to women's sport. It's in 3 sections. The first section I'm going to cover is about an athletics administrator. Lisa is then going to talk about a rowing administrator, and Sam is going to give the third one, which is about a netball administrator. And the individual that I'm dealing with is Violet Cambridge. I have to thank Lisa for raising Cambridge as a potential subject for biography, and Margaret for doing some work in terms of identifying some of her basic characteristics. Now, Violet was born in 1892 to an unmarried mother, Susan Hibbard, who was living as the wife of William Neal. She wasn't married to him, she was living as his wife. He was the proprietor of the Marine Engineer in 1901. She had an unsettled childhood. I initially put unhappy, but when we're looking backwards, we can't be that subjective about whether her childhood was happy or sad or whatever. But we do know it was unsettled, in that Neil, his wife of 30 years, took him to court for adultery and for cruelty in 1898, at a time when he was living with Violet's mother. And he was sued for embezzlement in 1906, so clearly he wasn't a particularly stable character. And one would assume, although it's difficult to assume, and for a lot of you in here working on biographies, making assumptions is not necessarily a good thing to do, but that the childhood was a little bit unsettled, which makes her progression through the social strata of British society even more remarkable. She married a chartered secretary called Daniel Cambridge in 1913, and she had William in 1913 and Susan, who died in infancy in 1916. And that death resulted in a court case. And she was convicted of infanticide, of killing the child fairly soon after it was born. But she wasn't, in the court's terms, considered responsible for that. And although today we might put that down to postnatal depression and difficulties of dealing with a newborn child, etc., in fact it was war related, and we need to remember that these people were going through particularly difficult times. She was sent to Holloway Prison, where the medical officer at Holloway Prison identified that she was terrified of zeppelins. That's the flying balloons that used to come over and drop bombs on London during the First World War. The film Suffragette, which came out recently, hints that she was in feminist groups and associated with feminist groups, and that she stood back from taking part in direct action with the suffragettes because she was afraid of going back to prison. But really, we've not been able to substantiate that. And one of the things you need to be careful of when you're looking at source material is using things like films, which don't always give you the right kind of perspective. They tend to, because it's much like a novel, they tend to actually make things up. She divorced in 1928 and married Leslie Gordon Wall in 1929. There's a picture there from the newspapers of their wedding. So looking at her working and public life, who was this woman? What did she do? Well, in 1911, in the census in 1911, the 19-year-old Violet was recorded as an artist. Now, it may be that she was an artiste, in that she was performing on the stage and so on, and that somebody's mistranscribed that. But she was shown as an artist. By 1918, so only 7 years later, she was an assistant controller to the department store Selfridges, and she was opening a beauty shop in Bond Street by 1926. And in 1939, using the National Register in 1939, we can identify that she was manager of Elizabeth Arden and a beauty specialist. Those are themes that really come throughout her whole career, in that she combined athletics and the administration of athletics with this specialist career as a beauty expert. And she mixed, in the end, for somebody who came from her background, remarkably, she mixed with the elite of London society. She's shown here with the Lady Mayoress at a later stage in her career in 1935. And she was involved in a whole lot of organisations of different kinds. We'll touch on one or two of those. But with the Women's Employment Federation in 1936, which was concerned with trying to get women into top positions in business and shops and retail and so on, she spoke about the opportunities in department stores for women's employment and in the beauty business as well. So she was involved in trying to get women into positions of pretty powerful positions within industry throughout the 1930s. When war came, she did her bit. She was chair of the Bond Street Buyer Fighter Fund, which was standard across the country in the Second World War, where people banded together in order to raise money to buy Spitfires, for example. And in 1942, she gave a talk on austerity and makeup to the BBC Home Service. We'll see a little bit later that she was quite regularly involved with the radio. She was a member of the Westminster Women's Royal Voluntary Service, mobile canteen, and she was wearing the uniform of the WRVS when she and her husband died in June 1944. They were attending a parade at the Guards Chapel, which was hit by a V2, which is one of the rockets that was sent over from Germany during this particular period, and she and her husband died at that point. So we've got a picture of a woman who moved quite quickly and easily up the social scale. She may have been exceptional. We can't assume that everybody had the same opportunities to make that kind of move socially during that particular period of time. But here's an example of somebody whose drive and personality and skills and maybe her networking as well enabled her to move social positions. Not necessarily because of sport, but maybe because of other factors, maybe through a beauty business, for example. Now, she was involved in athletics administration. She enjoyed athletics, skiing and canoeing. She wrote quite a lot on alpine sports as well. And we should remember that women during this time were pretty well engaged with climbing, even in the Alps, not just climbing on the hills and mountains in the UK. She mixed with the Lord Desses, who was president of the Women's Amateur Athletic Association, leading officials from the British Amateur Olympic Association, the Amateur Athletic Association and other national governing bodies. So she was moving quite nicely across levels of administration, sports administration, during this particular time. She was president of Middlesex Ladies Athletics Club, and that comes through quite a bit during this period of time. And I like some of the club reports which emphasised that they were social activities as well as physical activities. So we see this from 1926, where members journeyed down to General and Mrs. Nairn's estate at Turville near Henley, had a run over 3 miles of glorious country, and despite a sharp wind, a thoroughly enjoyable time was the result. Tea was served in a marquee in the grounds, and after a stroll round the gardens, we retired to the drawing room for music, etc. And we were all sorry when it was time to mount our char-a-banc and get back to Henley. Owing to having to cut the time very fine, we were unable to partake of the supper which had been arranged for us by our hosts. So, this is a different environment. This is a different kind of sport. This is one which is about participation and engagement in the activity, and just as much about the social side of the activity as about the physical side of the activity. We need to remember that when we look at high performance sport nowadays, we're looking at a different situation. In terms of the Women's Amateur Athletics Association, in 1923, Violet, who was already a member of the executive committee, took on the honorary secretary role, and she took on the responsibility for promoting and defending women's athletics, which was still under a lot of pressure because there were a lot of men who were very anti women's participation. She was appointed by the BBC to offer guidance on athletic activities to Women's Hour programme, and she appeared regularly on the radio giving talks on how to be an athletics organiser. And in 1924 she pointed out that numbers of women athletes had increased tremendously in the previous 3 years. The WAAA was established to look after the women's interests and to prevent their exploitation. And it was organised along strict amateur lines. And this is one of the things that comes out of Violet's talks and presentations and everything else in this time. Amateurism, a long established male practice in sports, was adopted very closely by people who were engaged in sports in this particular time. But, and different from a lot of men's sports, the class of individuals involved ranged from undergraduates to shop and factory employees. It wasn't limited to a particular class of society as far as the women's 3As were concerned. Costumes were strict, and the women's 3As were extremely keen that our girls should live up to the principles of amateur sport in all respects. But she did have boundaries. And those boundaries were clear when in 1925 she resigned as honorary secretary because of her disapproval of the discussion that was taking place about tug-of-war events, shot putting and hammer throwing for women, which she considered harmful and unfeminine, as well as her concerns that the association was not developing along the correct lines. She was involved as the women's chaperone in Amsterdam in 1928, and she also designed the uniform for the female team at that particular time as well. She was a member of the BOA, and she was involved as a founder member of the National Playing Fields Association. So we've got somebody here who's taken on board the task of promoting women's athletics, promoting women's sport, but doing it in a particular way, doing it in the amateur way, in the standard amateur way, and being very, very closely allied to this idea of being an amateur, doing it for fun, doing it for participation. Her life reflects a life of social mobility and moving up the social scale, an association with health and beauty, advocacy for women's sport, always arguing the case for why women should take part in sport, amateur principles, which she was adhered to throughout her connection with athletics during this period, moderation and feminine appropriate activity, not tug of war, not shot put and so on, but also egalitarianism in class and gender. People should be equal. So the working girl from the shop floor should participate just as much as the undergraduate. And in many respects, uncovering her biography helps, as the other two biographies do, in uncovering that kind of hidden history of women as sports leaders. It's a history that we've not really connected with in the past, and that we're beginning to connect with now. And we could certainly see that when we look at our next individual, who Lisa's going to talk about.
Thank you for that, Dave. I'm going to be talking about a lady called Amy Gentry, who she didn't set up the Women's Amateur Rowing Association, that's a lie, but she's really heavily involved with the administration of women's rowing over some 40 or 50 years, so she's kind of a lifelong administrator in the women's sports. And she's quite different actually in lots of ways from Violet Cambridge. She doesn't have the same kind of, doesn't have as many fingers in as many pies. She's very much centred on the sport of rowing, but we'll come on to that in a little bit. I'm going to start though with a look at modern rowing, because actually rowing is surprising, I think, in terms of its female leadership. It's had a female chair since 1989, and in the context of lots of other sports, even today, then that is unusual, as Dave was saying, with the statistics he opened with. So the late and great Dame Dialis, who's on the left there, took over the kind of leadership of the Amateur Rowing Association in 1989 and was succeeded by the lady on the right, Anna Marie Phelps, who is about to stand down as chair at the end of this month. So I've said this might be surprising, I think in part because the image of rowing is so elite, so masculine, and we might not expect this to be a sport that bucks the trend in terms of gender equality or more opportunities for women. And the other person I should mention actually that's not on the slide is Dame Catherine Granger, who, again, don't know how much you guys will know about her, but she was a multiple Olympic medalist. She retired as a rower at the end of the 2012 cycle and is now the current chair of UK sport. So a really senior role in British sport as a whole, not only within rowing. But let's head back. So into the 1920s, and I'm focusing on this organisation really because, I suppose, on the formation of a governing body, because it's quite distinct from participating in sport. So in forming a governing body, then you're looking at a more permanent and a more kind of organised structure for the sport. And Amy Gentry here is on the right. You can see this is her winning a race, I think, in about 1927, so quite soon after the association was formed in 1923. So in the 1920s, you do see greater opportunities for women in sport. So to some extent, perhaps this is a product of its time, but it is very much a product of individuals. So you can see up here the second quote on the screen. The foundation of the organisation is attributed to one woman, this Mrs. Summerton. And I was actually talking about her last week. At some point, that talk will go onto Playing Past website, and I strongly recommend you all to give it a listen, because it basically says the opposite of what I'm saying today, which is that she's the most important person, whereas today, obviously, it's all about Amy Gentry. But the point is that Kate Summerton, as an individual, takes the reins and decides to set up this organisation. And this is quite distinct from what we see in the men's sport, where it's a product of institutions. So you have your universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and really elite private clubs like Leander Rowing Club, places like that, that together decide that they're going to organise the sport. It's a product of the clubs, not of individuals. And on the women's side, that really isn't the case. So this has kind of an immediate impact on what their resources. If you think about the amount of money, straightforwardly, that was around in the classes of men that were at Oxford and Cambridge, and simply the more common management of finances at all by men rather than by women, then there is access to more stuff, more money, and more opportunities in some respects. The other is, of course, a question of legacy. If your organisation is founded on the University of Oxford, it's unlikely to disappear. If it's just one woman who is trying to organise it, what happens when she disappears? This quote up here, this comes from a little bit later on. This is from the 1960s, but this is Amy Gentry writing about the fact that the history of women's rowing is one of limited resources. So boats discarded by men's clubs, and of course there are some differences in the kind of equipment you might want to be using as a woman compared to a man, the weight and the size of the boat and all that kind of stuff. But also, what I think is more interesting actually is the second part of this, where she says that there's smaller numbers in the individual clubs, but also that the men's clubs here manage to retain more older members and supporters. So it's not only a question of the active participants in the sport, but at the point where men might stop rowing, they're still going to go to the club, they're still going to go to the club's races, they're still going to be putting money and effort into the club. And this is something that she says women find much more difficult. So anyway, crack on with Amy Gentry's actual life. So she's born in and around Weybridge, so it's on the Thames, and she rows kind of competitively, I guess, from the age of 16. She grows up on the river. The photo here is her with her father. She is an adult by this point. She's not being taught to row, although it looks a bit like that. But she kind of grows up very much on the water. And when she's 16, then she's invited to compete in a victory regatta in Weybridge. So it's an event arranged to celebrate peacetime and it's all about collaboration, and all the rhetoric around the event is very much about community. Now, she joins the Women's Amateur Rowing Association soon after its founding, probably about 6 months later, as an assistant to the founder who I was talking about earlier on. Not long after that, she establishes her own club, and it's just about 200 metres or so away from the club that she was recruited into to race at for this victory regatta, which had been Weybridge Rowing Club, hers creatively named Weybridge Ladies Amateur Rowing Club. In establishing her own club, though, she does also start cementing a bit more of a sense of legacy. And there are not many women's clubs that actually have survived as long as that one has. It does still exist today, whereas a lot of the women's clubs from this period definitely kind of came and went. I mentioned earlier on that she sits on this organisation for the best part of 50 years. She starts off as this assistant to the founder. She then takes on the honorary secretary role, and ultimately she chairs it. So she plays a really strong part in shaping the organisation, and she's also keen, certainly in the early part of that period, to try and increase opportunities for female rowers. So in 1927, she writes to the president of the organisation asking her to petition on their behalf to be included in the Olympic Games. That actually didn't happen for women in rowing until 1976, so quite a bit later. Lastly, in terms of character, and I mention this because of partly what Dave was talking about in terms of leadership traits, Amy had a reputation for being very, very direct, quite eccentric, and this idea of being quite indomitable. She wasn't one for the soft politics. She was quite direct, I guess, in looking for what she wanted. The other thing I should say that isn't on the slide, she, unlike Violet, she worked, she was a secretary, and so she talks quite a lot about being a business girl. She talks about how she can't always go to France to race, things like that. She can't do that because she has working commitments. But her job is very much a job. She is a secretary, she comes home, and then the rest of her life really is rowing. She doesn't have a particularly diverse, she doesn't really assume any kind of leadership or outreach type stuff in her professional life, unlike within her sport. The Women's Amateur Rowing Association remained separate from the men's until the 1960s. So it's quite a long period where the women were managing their own sports in their own way. And ultimately they're subsumed really into the men's organisation, largely because they have to be able to race at events like the European Championships and subsequently the Worlds and the Olympics. So it's kind of a necessity for them to be recognised by the men's governing body. But having such a long period where they're kind of determining their own future, if you like, you end up with a stronger kind of, a stronger base for what the sport should be and how it should progress. And actually a Women's Rowing Council existed within the Rowing Association until almost 2000. In terms of negotiating with the male establishment, to some extent she manages that on this individual level. So she manages to recruit people from the ARA to come and coach, to speak at her dinners. There is kind of interaction, but only on an individual level. Whereas institutionally, like I say, then the ARA actually takes them quite a long time to acknowledge and to support the women's sport. And these were the ones that controlled access to things like the Olympics and the Worlds, like I've mentioned. Lastly, in this picture here, then, she's the lady in the middle, and that's her receiving an OBE. And this is, I think, in 1968, certainly the late 60s. And what I think is interesting about this is that now we kind of take for granted that sports people get honours. It's huge. I think it's about 4% now of all of the honours that are given in a year go to people in sports. Actually, in the 1960s, really not so much, and certainly not in rowing. She's only the second person, male or female, to receive that level of recognition within the sport. So in a sense, then, she is negotiating these very masculine, these patriarchal structures that tend to recognise more masculine achievements, despite not being this political animal, which I think is quite an interesting kind of tension for her. In a sense, in fact, what Dave was talking about, this idea of doing things the standard amateur way, I'm not sure you can see that she did. Because although she wasn't pursuing money, she wasn't... her approach is much kind of less accommodating, shall we go with that? I think I'm going to wrap up more or less there and hand over to Sam.
So interestingly, the stories that have come before you, the biographies and narratives, have been focused on women who have taken on roles within organisations that have a very male-dominated factor. Netball, not so much. It's a very different organisation, but a way of looking at this is we need to understand physical education. We need to understand what was happening at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, and establish how did women access sport. And one of the ways that this was occurring was through the physical education establishments. And what we've got to remember is education today is taken for granted. We can all come to university. There's no barriers in place. But before World War I, whilst things were getting better, educational opportunities were really only for certain people, certain class, and mostly men. Higher education for women came much later. So how do we gain access for women in sport at this period of time? And one of the ways was through specialist physical training colleges. There weren't many, and it started with Martina Bergman Osterberg's college at Dartford, which was established in 1885. And this was where we get the very first boarded college that was designed for women to learn how to become physical educators. And the programme is something that you might all actually, if you listen to the kind of things that they were teaching or being taught, might be something that's reflected in your education now. They were doing things like child psychology, physiology, biomechanics, anatomy, as well as having practical components such as dance, gymnastics, which was very big as part of the movement of children at the time, swimming, and the coaching of team games. So what we get is Osterberg's college, and her graduates go on to form further physical training colleges at the time. And within these organisations, these women are actually both directly and indirectly linked to the development of women's team games at the time. They are enjoying male versions of sport like lacrosse, hockey and cricket within these establishments. And amongst that is this newly formed sport of netball that comes out of the physical training establishments. It became a really important component of the physical education programme for young girls, and it was really established and attributed to Dartford College and Osterberg specifically. But the governance of the sport isn't just held by one organisation. It actually is held by the Ling Physical Education Association, of which many of these individuals are founders. And this institution from 1901 controls how netball is played. What's important there is that actually netball becomes a very big marketing product for the association. So their main aim isn't just to look at netball, it's to govern physical education. But netball sells. It's their highest selling pamphlet, rule book, that is sent out to schools, to clubs, to physical training colleges. And so it's really heavily invested in and reinvested in. And not only is it within the UK, these pamphlets, these rules are sent across to the Commonwealth nations. So considering the impact of netball, it's no surprise that we get to a point where the Ling Association go, okay, we really need to consider the development of something bigger here. And so in 1929, we get members of the Ling Association plus members of the London and Home Counties Netball Federation joining together to discuss about a national governing body for this sport. And as a result, we get the All England Women's Netball Association, which is formed. And this is about providing central administration for the sport, further opportunities for girls and women to actually participate in the activity, not just in the schools, but in a club system. Something that, again, we take for granted today. And instrumental to this formation was this lady, Doris Wilkie. Unfortunately, this is the only image I have of her, and you can't really even see her. But, you know, important to kind of, you know, give some life and character to this individual. Doris Wilkie was from a typical middle-class background. She was educated in Swansea in Wales, and then she was given access to Bedford Physical Training College, where she learnt the trade of becoming a physical educator. Once she graduated, she actually remained at the college and became a lecturer in physical education and taught new generations of physical trainers. She was a core member of the Ling Association, which we know controlled netball in the early formative years. She was a committee member from the mid-1920s. She went on and became the secretary of the association in 1929, and her appointment coincided with these conversations about netball going alone. Throughout the minutes of the AENA, the All England Women's Netball Association, her name is there, it's splattered across the minutes constantly. And administratively, her association with other sports, like the Ling Association, lacrosse, cricket, hockey, she sat on lots of different boards. And so she could push the agenda of the Netball Association further than just within the sport itself. Really, her biggest contribution to the AENA was in umpiring and coaching. She was instrumental in developing the policies, the rules, the training and the accreditation of umpires. She was the first person to put together theoretical components as well as practical components. She gave clear guidelines on umpire assessments, and she even went across the UK and put on demonstrations and tested other individuals so that they could be accredited umpires. Essentially, she became the voice of umpiring and the voice for umpires within the organisation. So if rules were changed, she would be fighting for, does this suit us, does this help umpiring and governing the sport itself from a practical level. Her valuable help and technical knowledge was very much triumphed. And so it's no surprise that when we start to get discussions around forming accredited coaches within the sport, and that was pre-World War II, that she was there to set up and to test and to give this accreditation for netball coaches. And some of her biggest contributions come in publications. She wrote several texts on the instructive and tactical aspects of netball, and that was for school teachers, for clubs, for coaches, and it went across the whole of the Commonwealth. She also produced several texts on hints to umpires, and also had an impact on the amendment of the rules at this period of time. So you would think that that's enough, but remember she's doing this alongside a full-time job as a physical education trainer. This is voluntary work. This is, you know, something that they're just doing in their free time for the love and the enjoyment of sport. So when we hit the 1940s period and there's uncertainty over how the sport is going to develop, how sport is going to come back after World War II, then she still continues. She is part of that rebranding. And at that point, we move away from the organisation being noted as women's netball. We take that away. It's the All England Netball Association. And within that, we rebrand, we bring in new sports. Basketball becomes part of their branding. Hazena, which is a handball-type game, as well as other handball sports, all governed by this Netball Association. Part of this change led to ideas around internationalisation. At this point, the rules of netball are different and played differently across the world. So we want something that actually we can control and that we can get competition to a bigger audience. And so Wilkie, she basically became that advocate for international exchange. She was providing financial support for teams to go and tour South Africa, for teams to come over from Australia, Bermuda, the USA. And so this conversation around sport and internationalisation was occurring within netball. However, it was in 1956 in the Australian tour, which came to England, that we start to really make headway. And at this point, Wilkie is the chairwoman of the All England Netball Association. Part of the discussions that occur between Aina and the Australian team is, can we make this something that we can do more regularly? Can we get netball to a place where we can have international competition? It took a few years, but in 1960, through correspondence with Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, parts of the Philippines, that we actually do come together and agree to an international federation. So in 1960, we get the International Federation of Women's Basketball and Netball that's formed. Two sports joined together as one. And when that organisation formed, tribute was given to Aina because they were instrumental in getting this discussion moving. And Wilkie, as chair, part of that praise and thanks. And they were honoured with hosting the first World Tournament, which was held at Chelsea College, one of the physical training centres at the time for women. When we get the International Federation, Wilkie's moved up. She's no longer chairwoman, she's president of the association of Aina. And so she's now in charge of making sure that the schools, clubs, all start to adopt these new international codes. And so she would go out and push the new rules into the UK. With refreshed interest, netball at this point becomes the largest female participation sport. No, it's okay. And Wilkie's involvement in netball, very much part of her life narrative. She never married. She used her position as an educator to give women opportunities that previously would have been not even considered. Unfortunately, Wilkie became sick and she died literally 2 or 3 months before the very first World Netball tournament. She died in a nursing home in Bedford, but with nobody, no husband, no family. She left quite a lot of money in probate, so it was just never received anywhere. I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that her story sounds extraordinary. You know, this woman doing all these things, how fabulous, you know, she must have been the centre of this organisation. But she's just one of many who've got very similar narratives. And here we're just looking at netball. So these are the women who formed the first netball organisation. And to just give you an idea, you've got Edith Clark, who was the first president. She was a physical training instructor. She was a graduate of Dartford College, but she was a hockey and lacrosse international. She was the very first captain of the very first female lacrosse team in 1913. She was a tennis player who went to Wimbledon. She also wrote the books on hockey and lacrosse coaching. You've got Cecily Birdie, as she was affectionately called, Reed. She was the principal of Bedford College. She had outstanding achievements around the choreographing of mass events, and so she put on big dance displays, gymnastics displays in front of the King and Queen and at Wembley in the 1930s. She was also the author of texts on vaulting. She also wrote texts on lacrosse umpiring. And then finally, you get people like Phyllis Colson, who she taught for a short period of time, but due to severe arthritis couldn't continue, and instead went into administration. She became the organiser of the physical education for the National Organisation of the Girls' Clubs in 1930. She had a huge impact basically on the formation of women's sport outside of the school system. As a result, she was the founder of the Central Council for Physical Recreation, and that should be a name that you are all familiar with, because that later became the Sport and Recreation Alliance, and that is still today the governor of young people's participation in physical activity. It's still funded, still part of the government strategy for sport today. And one of the big movements that came out of that was the Keep Fit movement. And she was instrumental to the development of that. So what I suppose I'm trying to say here is that netball is a start, but this isn't the only sport in where there was these kind of women working. And as we can see through the presentation today, these women are there. But the problem is we either don't look for them or we haven't uncovered them yet. And so whilst Wilkie's life, you know, and her as an individual, she's seen as a source of inspiration, that story is only within netball. Once she dies and the people who know her die, we don't hear about it any further. Whereas we tend to hear about maybe some of the male administrators, male coaches, because their story is taken further and wider. So it's really important that we do uncover these narratives, because it helps us to shape and change and understand how sport actually influences life. This is, you know, the start of a women's liberation movement, the suffrage movement. These women are advocating for women and changing their life as a result. But we cannot talk about any biography without talking about the context. In this case, physical education, women's history, class. It all becomes part of that narrative. And this is paving the way for the future. This is where the research needs to go. And as you can see, you know, we've all picked a sport, we've all come out with different and similar ideas. It is more than one sport, but that is a good place for us to all start. And finish, yes. That's it.